Uh, Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Center for Asian Studies, I'm very happy to start this new session on Southeast Asia. This seminar is part of our ongoing seminar on Asia, the Asia Update, which started in 2018. This is a collaboration between the Center for Asian Studies and the Center for International Relations. So, as director of the Center for Asian Studies, I'm very happy to have today two fantastic and young and bright scholars, Dr. Sarah Teo from Singapore, and of course, Dr. Nicole Yen from Católica. So, thank you very much for being here today. I don't know if Diego wants to say something
yes,
on behalf of the
good morning,
center.
everyone. Yes, good morning, everyone. I give you the most cordial welcome to this seminary is organized with the Center of Asian Studies. Asian role and the Indo-Pacific is changing with the time. So today we have a special guest. First, we have to present Nicole Yen, Associate Professor of Catholic University and researcher of the Center of International Studies and Center of Asia Studies in Catholic University. Professor Yen, the floor is yours, and so you can introduce the special guest today.
Buenos dias, good morning or good evening to everyone connected on whatever part of the world, and welcome also from my side to this new edition of the Asia Update series. In this edition, we will look at ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and I'm very happy that we are joined by Dr. Sarah Teo from the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, RSIS in short, at Nanyang Technological University of Singapore. The whole world, as Diego said, has been looking at the Asia Pacific for quite some time now, this crucial region for the future of international order, where great power rivalry between the US and China has played out rather strongly, especially in comparison to Latin America, that has been rather insignificant in terms of geopolitical relevance as of late, or some might even argue not only as of late, but already for quite some time. For Chile in particular, the emergence of the idea of an Indo-Pacific region that is replacing the one of the Asia-Pacific has sparked new interest due to the country's historical outlook, not towards its own region, but towards the ocean, towards the Pacific and towards Asia. So there's always the question whether this bigger region of the Indo-Pacific will have space to include the Pacific Rim states on this side, and of course, whether Chile's Asia outlook will translate into substantive policies. But today we'll be concentrating on the Asian continent and particularly on the role of Southeast Asia. It is a great honor for us to have Sarah Teo joining us, who currently is a research fellow at the Regional Security Architecture Program at RSIS. She holds a PhD from the University of Sydney and has researched extensively on multilateral security and defense cooperation in ASEAN and the Asia Pacific, on middle powers in the Asia Pacific, as well as IR theory. Sarah is the co-author, together with Ralph Emmers, of Security Strategies of Middle Powers in the Asia Pacific that was published with Melbourne University Publishing in 2018. And she's also the co-editor with Bobinder Singh of Minilateralism in the Indo-Pacific, that is a publication from this year by Routledge. Her articles have also been published in peer-reviewed journals, a list of the most relevant journals for the Asia-Pacific region, including the Pacific Review, International Relations of the Asia-Pacific, and Australian Journal of International Affairs, as well as platforms such as the East Asia Forum, the Diplomat, and PACNet, which I'm sure many of those connected will know. From 2012 to 2015, she was a delegate to the Track 2 network of ASEAN defense and security institutions. Sarah, thank you very much for joining us today. The remaining time of our event will be divided into a presentation, and we will then have some 20 minutes for Q&A. Please send your questions via the chat, and if you don't feel comfortable with English, feel free to put them up in Spanish, and we will get them translated. Without further ado, Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicole, for the very kind introduction. And of course, I would like to also thank you and the UC Asian Studies Center and the UC Center for International Studies for inviting me to this seminar. So a very good day to everyone. Let me just try to share my slides. Is that fine?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Right. Okay, so today, for the next half an hour or so, I will be looking at ASEAN's role in the Indo-Pacific, particularly in terms of whether its role in the regional security architecture will change given the changing regional dynamics. So this is the outline of my presentation. I will first provide a brief overview of Asia's post-Cold War security architecture, and then I will move into addressing the rise of the Indo-Pacific. I will discuss the key points from the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, highlight current trends in the evolving regional security architecture, and then I will end off with kind of a looking ahead, 3 scenarios for ASEAN's role in the Indo-Pacific. So let us get straight into it. So Asia's post-Cold War security architecture has been described by experts such as Victor Cha and Andrew Yeo as what they call a complex patchwork, which basically means that there exist various cooperative arrangements that overlap in terms of membership and even issue areas. So a pictorial representation of this complex patchwork is on the screen, credited of course to Andrew Yeo at the Catholic University of America. And he wrote a great book on Asia's regional architecture, which I believe was published last year. So you can see in this picture, it represents both the US hub and spoke system of regional alliances, as well as broader multilateral institutions such as ASEAN, APEC, and smaller groups such as the Six-Party Talks and the China-Japan-Korea Trilateral Cooperation Mechanism. So what I would like to do for now is to really zoom in on the regional bilateralism and multilateralism in recent times and focus on the gaps that have emerged in the regional security architecture. So a bit of a shameless plug here. Much of the contents in the next 2 slides are actually based on a book on unilateralism in the Indo-Pacific that I had the fortune to co-edit with my colleague, Bhupinder Singh. And this was recently published in May of this year. So there are many types of bilateral relationships that undergird the regional security architecture in Asia. But here I want to focus on the continuation of the San Francisco system of US alliances, because this hub and spokes network has been one of the most persistent forms of security cooperation, I think, at a systemic level since the Cold War. But the functions of these alliances have evolved along with changing geopolitical circumstances. So for instance, the ROK-US alliance, although it still serves the core function of deterring North Korea, it has also expanded to include other global issues such as climate change and humanitarian assistance. So this bilateralism with the US at the center also forms the basis for greater connections between the spokes, such as between Japan and Australia. But this hub and spoke system increasingly faces pressures arising from structural change, which has arguably narrowed the gap between the United States and China. China's economic rise, especially the fact that many of the US allies that rely on Washington for their security guarantees also have China among their top trading partners, and President Trump's America First policy, which has seen him complaining about free-riding allies and insisting on fair burden sharing with wealthy countries. So it is premature, I think, to predict the demise of US bilateral alliances in the region, because there continues to be strong support or hope for US commitment and regional presence from its allies and partners. But questions have been raised about the sustainability of the US alliance network and Washington's leadership in the region. In contrast to the early presence of US-centered bilateralism, security multilateralism in the region was initially slow to develop due to mistrust stemming from past conflicts. Nevertheless, as Cold War tensions wound down, a nascent multilateral architecture emerged in the region, first with APEC in 1989, and subsequently with arrangements centered mainly on ASEAN, as well as its associated platforms such as the ASEAN Regional Forum, the ADMM Plus, and the East Asia Summit. But so far, I think even with these security-oriented platforms, the focus is still more on non-traditional security, such as humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, rather than the strategic type of issues. Nevertheless, over the past 3 decades, ASEAN has been the main convener of such multilateral dialogue and cooperative platforms that also include major and regional powers such as China, Japan, and the United States. And these powers have been committed to the ASEAN way of cooperation, which emphasizes consensus building and process over outcomes. So to some observers, I think this has been surprising given that ASEAN actually comprises 10 of the smallest or weakest states in the region. But a common explanation here is that it is precisely because ASEAN is small and weak and does not pose a threat to other regional powers. Therefore, these other bigger powers are willing to accept ASEAN's diplomatic or institutional centrality in the region. But from the late 2000s or early 2010s, however, doubts over the ASEAN way and the association's unity have deepened as regional challenges such as the South China Sea disputes have started to come to the fore. ASEAN has come under fire for its perceived ineffectiveness in resolving regional challenges, especially when it comes to socializing China's behavior, and its multitude of forums have been criticized as merely, I quote, talk shops. So this criticism in recent times has really materialized in Washington's current approach towards ASEAN meetings. I think the US has appeared to lose interest or at least become less committed to the kind of broad and inclusive cooperation that ASEAN seeks to promote. For example, while Washington continues to participate in the ASEAN-US meetings, it downgraded its representation last year. And President Trump has skipped the main East Asia Summit meeting for 3 years in a row. So that indicates, I think, a loss of interest at the very least in terms of the symbolic importance that has been so strongly associated with ASEAN. So the inadequacies and uncertainties arising from the 2 traditional pillars of the regional security architecture has created a conducive context for an alternative conception, which is the Indo-Pacific. So there is no consensus on the geographical boundaries of such a region. But among the main actors driving this reconceptualization of the region, I think there is shared agreement on several elements. So first, the need to address the gaps in the current security architecture, especially when it comes to dealing with strategic or security issues. Second, the need to acknowledge the linkages between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And third, the rise of India as an important strategic actor in the regional context. So I thought I would just outline the key milestones of the Indo-Pacific concept. And these are from my perspective, which I admit, and I'm sure they are prone to my own selection bias. But I think they capture the major evolution points of the concept quite nicely. So in 2007, Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe delivers the by now famous speech titled Confluence of the Two Seas to India's parliament, where he talks about a broader Asia that encompasses both the Indian and Pacific Oceans and also incorporates the United States and Australia. Around 2010 and 2011, then US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton starts to refer to the region as the Indo-Pacific. In 2012, Australia released its Australian in the Asian Century white paper, in which a short section discussed this new Indo-Pacific conception of the Asian region. By 2013, Australia was referring to the Indo-Pacific as a single strategic arc. Around the same time, Indonesia also started to embrace this concept publicly. This was followed by India in 2015. In 2016, Japan officially announced its free and open Indo-Pacific vision. 2017, at an APEC meeting, President Trump outlined his vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific. In 2018, at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, India's Prime Minister Modi outlined India's version of the Indo-Pacific, essentially that it would be inclusive and open with ASEAN at the center. In 2019, after some reluctance, ASEAN issued the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. In the same year, the United States' free and open Indo-Pacific strategy was formally outlined by the Department of Defense and the Department of State. There was also the entrance of a relatively new actor into the debate. This was France, which released its Indo-Pacific strategy. And more recently, just 2 months ago, Germany released policy guidelines for the Indo-Pacific. So with so many visions for the Indo-Pacific emerging from different actors, I think we can see some areas of convergences and divergences in their respective formulations. So first, there is shared concern about China's behavior, and perhaps with the exception of Washington, also a concern about Sino-US dynamics that may destabilize the region. So there is a need to preserve the rules-based and multilateral order in the region, as well as to maintain freedom of navigation. They also agree on the importance of strengthening connectivity and related infrastructure. So these are in part a response to provide an alternative to China's massive Belt and Road Initiative, which it announced in 2013. ASEAN's central role is also acknowledged in the various visions, although there are debates about to what extent this is a concrete commitment. And I think this commitment to ASEAN has actually evolved a bit. One commonly cited example is that in Japan's initial formulation of its Indo-Pacific strategy, ASEAN's role was missing. But now Japan, along with the US, Australia, and India, all recognize, at the very least in rhetoric, that that there is ASEAN centrality in the Indo-Pacific. So in terms of divergences, I think the first one would be geographical scope. And I don't want to get into too much detail about this, but essentially the boundaries at their broadest range all the way from the eastern coast of Africa to the western coast of the US mainland. And within this broad space, different countries have carved out different areas which they regard as their understanding of the Indo-Pacific. But in general, I think we are definitely looking at the inclusion of India, the Eastern Indian Ocean, through what was previously known as the Asia-Pacific, which of course also includes the United States. The second area of divergence, I think, is in the approaches towards China, which differs depending on to what extent the countries view China as a revisionist power that seeks to upturn the status quo. So on one end of the spectrum, we have the United States, which has publicly labeled China as a revisionist power. And on the other end of the spectrum, if we look at ASEAN's Indo-Pacific vision, there is no explicit mention of China at all. And I think in the middle would be where the rest of the countries would fall, depending on their respective threat perceptions. So for most countries at this current time, despite all the tensions, I don't think it is about complete exclusion of China per se, but really about being able to create the space for themselves in the event that any major powers, including China, seek to destabilize the region or violate established norms and rules. The third area, I think, is the role of the US. And I think this really comes down to the kind of relationship that the various countries have with Washington. So for instance, US treaty allies such as Australia and Japan would naturally want US dominance in the Indo-Pacific. But for India and others like Indonesia, who was a key driver of the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, for these other countries, I think they would seek a more multipolar regional order where the overall power distribution is a bit more balanced. And the final, but certainly not the last, but the final area that I would like to address in terms of difference is whether the respective Indo-Pacific strategies focus more on security and defense or more on economics and infrastructure. So I think this is reflected very clearly in how the United States places priority on security and defense areas, while others such as Japan and definitely ASEAN have a greater focus on infrastructure and economics. So there are important areas, I think, of both similarities as well as differences among the countries that have been promoting the Indo-Pacific concept, which I think gives us quite a good idea of the complexities inherent in this evolution of the regional architecture. So I thought I would also spend a bit of time just briefly discussing the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. I think for a while, ASEAN had been reluctant to take the lead in the Indo-Pacific debate for fear of exacerbating tensions and divisions, and concerned that an Indo-Pacific concept would result in it losing centrality. Because if you recall, initial formulations of the Indo-Pacific were scant on details of ASEAN's role. But at the 34th ASEAN Summit in June 2019, ASEAN leaders agreed to issue the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. So as I mentioned earlier, Indonesia played a big part here. It was among the early adopters of the Indo-Pacific concept, with the reasoning that Indonesia was strategically located between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. And Jakarta pushed for ASEAN to take the lead on shaping the Indo-Pacific concept, framing it as vital for ASEAN's relevance and centrality. So despite, I think, the overall and general unenthusiasm for the concept, ASEAN leaders eventually endorsed the document. So I think it's also noteworthy that the document was named Outlook rather than Policy or Approach. It suggests that ASEAN is still reluctant to be completely proactive in the debate, Also, although the AOIP was released in June 2019, many of ASEAN's statements continue to refer to the region as Asia-Pacific rather than adopting the language of the Indo-Pacific. ASEAN is moreover quite explicit in saying that the outlook is not to create new mechanisms, but rather to strengthen and revitalize existing ASEAN-led mechanisms. So that aims to reinforce ASEAN centrality. So I think that it's quite clear that ASEAN efforts here are not so much to support one power over another, but really to make sure that the association does not become irrelevant amid the ongoing regional shifts. And of course, the outlook is also based on well-known ASEAN principles of inclusivity, respect for sovereignty, non-intervention, and so on. So just a few of the AOIP's main points. As I mentioned earlier, that it is inclusive. There's no singling out of any countries. In fact, no countries are mentioned in the document at all. And it simply calls for synergizing with other sub-regional arrangements, such as the Indian Ocean Rim Association, which is IORA, and Mekong frameworks. So this is starkly different from the rest of the countries, especially the US, which points out China as a revisionist power. So it also underscores ASEAN centrality in the Indo-Pacific and emphasizes the important role played by ASEAN-led mechanisms, especially the leaders-led East Asia Summit. And it highlights 4 areas of cooperation. 1, maritime cooperation. 2, connectivity. Number 3, sustainable development goals. And the 4th area is economic and other possible areas of cooperation. So it's very focused on economics, development, and technical cooperation. There is very little priority given to security and defense issues. So with this outlook on the Indo-Pacific, ASEAN has tried to reclaim its central role in the regional architecture. But I think it is getting harder to maintain this effort because the Indo-Pacific is one part of the change that the regional security architecture is undergoing. And yes, it is an overall reshaping of the regional discourse. But there are other associated changes that are also likely to affect ASEAN's role in the region. And the first development here that I would like to highlight is the emergence of non-ASEAN, mini or multilateral initiatives. I think to be fair, there has always been non-ASEAN platforms such as the 6-party talks and the China, Japan, Korea trilateral mechanism. But as you know, these platforms have not gone very far. And I think from the mid-2010s, there has been a proliferation of a different kind of minilateralism, if you will. In particular, these are the new mechanisms that are meant to drive the Indo-Pacific concept. So we have trilateral arrangements such as the Australia-India-Japan dialogue that was inaugurated in 2015, and the India-France-Australia Forum launched just 2 months ago. And there is also talk of an Australia-India-Indonesia process that is expected to involve the foreign and defense ministers. The second one here is the revival of the Quad in 2017. So unlike the Quad 1.0, which faded into the background about a year or so after it was introduced, the Quad 2.0 actually seems to be gaining steam. Since it was relaunched in November 2017, it has held 6 working level meetings and 2 ministerial level meetings. And for the first time since 2007, Australia is participating in the ongoing naval exercise Malabar alongside India, the United States, and Japan. So there is certainly a strong security or military dimension to the Quad. Since March, there has also been what observers call a Quad Plus arrangement, in which addition to the 4 Quad countries also involve South Korea, New Zealand, and Vietnam. So deputy foreign ministers of these 7 countries have met virtually, quite regularly actually, for 12 times so far, since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. While discussions at these meetings have thus far focused primarily on responses to COVID, the fact of its existence, I think, indicates the possibility for it to develop into a new multilateral arrangement that could persist into a post-COVID world. But to be fair, I think formalizing this Quad Plus arrangement beyond the COVID issue may be an uphill task. So the second development here is more of a direct consequence of the pandemic, which is that large multilateral meetings that characterize the ASEAN way of cooperation has been put on hold. And depending on how the situation develops, this could actually affect ASEAN's traditional convener role in the region, and consequently the institutional or diplomatic centrality that it has sought. So over the years, ASEAN-led meetings have served as a channel for officials to meet with each other, not only at the main ASEAN-led forums, but also on the sidelines. And this includes meetings which do not involve any ASEAN member states at all. So take the Quad, for instance, from its relaunch in 2017 to 2019, its working level meetings were held on the sidelines of ASEAN meetings hosted in ASEAN countries when senior officials convened for the ASEAN Regional Forum or the East Asia Summit. And although ASEAN has no direct role in the Quad, this is precisely how it has been able to demonstrate its usefulness, which is as a convener in regional multilateralism. But this year, the senior officials met virtually instead, and there was no need for an ASEAN platform. And the Quad Ministerial meeting in October was held standalone in Tokyo in the middle of a pandemic when many multilateral meetings have been postponed or moved onto virtual platforms. The first Quad Ministerial meeting was held last year, actually, but it was not on the sidelines of an ASEAN forum. It was held on the sidelines of a United Nations session in New York. Nevertheless, the symbolism of the second Quad Ministerial vis-a-vis ASEAN, I think, could not be more evident. And if this continues, the question then becomes what that means for ASEAN's traditional convening role in the region. And the third emerging challenger for ASEAN would be the developments in the Mekong sub-region. Some observers have drawn parallels between the dynamics in the Mekong versus the dynamics in the South China Sea. So I don't really want to get into the details of this, but I just want to highlight that unlike the South China Sea issue, which has sort of come under ASEAN's purview, especially in terms of the declaration of conduct and the potential code of conduct, the Mekong has so far been left outside of the main ASEAN agenda. But as several other experts have pointed out, the Mekong is quickly becoming a new battleground for Sino-US rivalry, and China clearly holds the upper hand within the Lancang-Mekong Cooperation Framework, which also includes Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, Vietnam. So basically 5 ASEAN member states and China. And the development of the economies and societies of the downstream Mekong countries are vulnerable to China's control of the river. On its part, the United States has reinvigorated its Lancang-Mekong initiative alongside the Free and Open Indo-Pacific strategy, with other actors such as Japan and South Korea contributing towards infrastructure building and development assistance as well. So given that half of the ASEAN member states have their immediate interest in the Mekong, the dynamics there would quite likely affect ASEAN unity and cooperation as well, and impinge on its role in the regional architecture. So taking all I've said into consideration, I just want to conclude with sort of a thought exercise for ASEAN's future in the Indo-Pacific. So looking ahead, I think there are 3 scenarios for ASEAN's role in the region. This is, of course, overly simplified, and reality is much more complex. But I thought these 3 outcomes would summarize the key points pretty well. So the first scenario, A, which is on the left of the screen, is that ASEAN gradually becomes irrelevant in the region. And this, I think, would really be a situation where ASEAN countries continue to stick to its current traditions and ways of working, even amid changing geopolitical circumstances. And in the longer term, ASEAN's partners and possibly even some of its member states find that their interests are better served through other platforms. The second scenario, C, on the right, is that ASEAN retains its centrality as non-ASEAN platforms or initiatives for leadership flounder. So this has actually happened before, when Japan and China were seeking to assert leadership over the East Asia Summit in the mid-2000s, and also when Australia proposed the Asia-Pacific Community Initiative in the late 2000s. So in both cases, the outcome was actually to reinforce ASEAN centrality in the region, because having anyone else lead these efforts was considered too controversial. So these, I think, are the 2 extreme scenarios, one which is obviously not good for ASEAN, and the other which is the best scenario that ASEAN could find itself in. Given current circumstances and the way that things are developing, I think neither is likely to materialize completely. What is more likely is a middle path scenario B, which is where ASEAN continues to be valued for inclusive, broad engagement that involves a range of partners, alongside proliferation of non-ASEAN-led like-minded coalitions that are a bit more targeted or functional, which is actually already what the current situation is like. So that's a clear distinction, I think, between ASEAN's function, where conflicting parties can come together, and the other more exclusive coalitions such as the Quad. But to ensure that we don't slide towards scenario A, it does mean that ASEAN should persist in efforts to strengthen the capacity of its member states in economics, development, and other areas. And of course, for ASEAN member states to work towards maintaining the organization's unity and neutrality too. Because I think that is how ASEAN can ensure that it continues to play a constructive role in the region. So I think I will stop here. Thank you very much for listening to me ramble on for the past 25 minutes or so. I will be happy, of course, to hear any comments or take any questions.
Sorry, there was just a bad moment that my connection failed. Sarah, you ended your presentation. I missed the last seconds. I'm very sorry for that. But thank you for being so well on time. I tried to get back on the computer, but meanwhile I continue on the mobile phone, and we started to get the first questions in. The first one, if I recall the order correctly, is from Maria Mont, and she asks, to what extent is the Indo-Pacific really replacing already the Asia-Pacific, and how is this being received by countries beyond China?
I think that the Indo-Pacific is still a work in progress. For ASEAN itself, ASEAN issued the outlook on the Indo-Pacific in June 2019, but since then, I think in a lot of its documents, it is still mainly using the term Asia-Pacific rather than Indo-Pacific. So I think there is some reluctance there. So that is ASEAN. But on the other hand, I think outside of ASEAN, there are certain countries that have been very enthusiastic about the concept. And I think that, for example, Australia, Japan, and even Indonesia. So I think it differs. The attitude towards the Indo-Pacific concept differs depending on which country, depending on where they are geographically located and how they view their place in the region.
Great. Then we have another question that is someone watching on YouTube, apparently. Will the COVID-19 pandemic lead to stronger regionalism in ASEAN?
I think the hope is that it will. There is cooperation taking in terms of dialogue, especially on the ASEAN Plus 3 platform. So this is the platform where ASEAN cooperates with China, South Korea, and Japan. I think there's a lot of cooperation going on there in terms of responding to COVID, setting up funds for ASEAN member states to be able to utilize in the management of the pandemic. So on the one hand, I think regionalism will get stronger. But on the other, I think the worry is also that COVID-19 has actually reinforced a lot of national boundaries. And we can see a lot of areas where I think national interests may conflict, where a country's national interest may conflict with another country's national interest. So I think that is probably the worst case scenario that we hope will not persist, for long. I think you're on mute.
I'm back now, I guess. A few questions actually deal with the topic that's probably the elephant in the room. Is the US elections, where we still don't have a result. But could you just speak about what we might expect the possible scenarios? Will there be any changes if the next president is called Biden? What could we expect in a second term of Trump? Would there be any changes? What are maybe the expectations within ASEAN on the future US president?
Okay, well, maybe we start first with a potential second Trump administration. I don't think we are likely to see much change. I think Trump has been very clear about what he wants from his allies, his partners in the region. So I think we would probably see a lot continuation of things such as the push for its allies to share the cost, its disinterest in ASEAN, and a very strong promotion of its own free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. For a few potential Biden administration, I think the difference between a Biden administration and a Trump administration would probably be more in terms of style than substance, mainly because I think the problems that it has with China currently are not going to go away. And I think the attitudes in both Washington and Beijing have been pretty entrenched over the past 4 or 5 years. So I don't think that there will be much turning back now. But in terms of style, I would see two main differences. So one is in terms of the coherence, I think, of the US-Asia policy. I think a Biden administration would probably have a more coherent Asia policy, less inconsistencies. And overall, I think it would seek to really improve the relationship with allies, at least, diplomatically. And the second area where I think a Biden administration might differ from a Trump administration is where ASEAN is concerned. So I think Biden is more likely to show up at ASEAN meetings, especially the East Asia Summit. And at the very least, I think that would really demonstrate that the US is committed to ASEAN centrality and is committed to building up ASEAN's capacity to make it a stronger organization.
Great. We have another question that concerns the India and China-Japan disputes, respectively. The question is, how would an escalation in either of these relations affect ASEAN?
Well, I think I would say that the positive thing about this is neither the India-China conflict nor China-Japan dispute actually involves any ASEAN member states. So in that sense, I don't think it would affect ASEAN much. And there's also, I think, in ASEAN an unspoken agreement that, bilateral disputes should not affect multilateral cooperation. Although I think we are seeing that a bit less these days. But I think ultimately, I don't see a big impact of the India-China conflict and the China-Japan dispute on ASEAN, because from the ASEAN point of view, I think that ASEAN believes that the major powers or the regional powers, should resolve disputes among themselves. What ASEAN can do, of course, is to provide a platform, on the sidelines of these larger meetings for the major powers to come together and talk. But I think that's where its role was stopped.
Yeah. Then there's a question that is connected to Latin America's role with ASEAN. How is cooperation with the Pacific Alliance seen in ASEAN? I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Pacific Alliance.
I'm not, I must admit.
Okay, then we will skip that one. I guess it's an indication already.
I would love to hear your thoughts on it as well.
A partial answer. Well, we'll probably deal with that in a future seminar, but it's already a partial answer. It's essentially an economic trading bloc, and the question is here, which looks towards Asia. And the question is here, could ASEAN someday join an organization of similar nature? So probably the answer would be right now, we don't see that happening, at least in the short term. There's another question about India. While India acknowledges ASEAN centrality in the Indo-Pacific, do you think that India quitting RCEP negotiations would affect pursuing deeper India-ASEAN cooperation in the Indo-Pacific?
I think it will, to an extent, because as an organization, ASEAN was founded for a security reason in the Cold War. But since then, I think it has been driven very much by economic imperatives. So even in the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, the focus is not so much on security or defense, but on economic prosperity, development. How do we build infrastructure so that ASEAN member states can ride the wave of economic development. So I think India pulling out of RCEP would affect ASEAN's perception of the regional powers' commitment to Southeast Asia. But on the other hand, India has also, I think, been stepping up cooperation in other areas. For instance, I believe in COVID and also in the defense area. So I think it's really ultimately a balance in terms of what India and ASEAN can do together.
I want to smuggle in a question that I have before continuing with the ones that are coming in. That is about a week or 10 days ago, former Singaporean diplomat Bilahari Kausikan expressed publicly some easiness of various ASEAN member states with Cambodia and Laos ties to China, which seem to grow ever closer. Is that splitting away or letting some members go really an option for ASEAN that is on the table?
Well, I mean, I think that's a very tough question. Firstly, in the sense that, you know, who gets to stay and who has to leave ASEAN? And secondly, who gets to decide who is in and out of ASEAN? But I think what has been overlooked in a lot of the reporting about Mr. Kausikan's comments is that this is really an option for the future. So, and I interpret this as in the far future when ASEAN is, when it's a last resort for ASEAN. So basically ASEAN is no longer operating or functioning well, ASEAN is breaking down, and then we consider that option. But I think for the immediate future, I don't see that as really a viable option. And if you recall in 2015, there were also talk that ASEAN should expel Myanmar because of the Rohingya issue. But it's 5 years later, and I think the talk has died down a bit, and Myanmar is still in ASEAN. But if we do expel, I think, any member, I think then the first question facing ASEAN would really be, is it really better for ASEAN that these dissenting members are outside rather than in the organization? And because then what does that mean for Southeast Asia? Does that mean that ASEAN community building and Southeast Asia community building has failed? Because then I think that has pretty big implications for the future of the region as a whole. And I think, ASEAN is ultimately an intergovernmental organization. There's no supranational authority to govern it. And it has always operated on a very strong principle of non-interference. And the fact is that it has 10 member countries, and which basically means it has 10 different sets of core or national interests that it has to kind of coordinate and deal with. And the best case scenario would be, I think, a situation where each of the 10 member countries have their core interests overlap to some extent with the regional interests. But that is, of course, difficult to achieve in some areas. But of course, ultimately, this is ASEAN choice on whether it wants to expel certain members. Because I think to expel certain members, there's also a need to get consensus from all the other member states. So can we even reach, that point within ASEAN? I think that is quite unlikely for the moment.
Then we have one person asking here, how does the role of ASEAN as a mediator in the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific regions look like?
Mediator. So, okay. So I think in ASEAN's origins, it was never really intended to be a mediator where major or regional powers were concerned. It was set up as an organization to resolve Southeast Asian disputes. So, for example, Indonesia has acted as a mediator in the Thailand and Cambodia dispute over the temple. But when it comes to major powers, I think the mediator role is still not very strong for ASEAN yet. Firstly, because the power gap is so big, right, between ASEAN and the major powers. And the major powers will always utilize the power gap to their advantage. So it is difficult for ASEAN to be a mediator to unwilling parties. But if both parties are willing to come to an ASEAN platform and negotiate, I think it has generally gone quite well. And I guess I would raise this example, which I think you might find a bit weird, but it's the most recent example I can think of, which is the Trump-Kim summit in Singapore and Vietnam. So where ASEAN's role, neither the US nor North Korea is part of the 10 ASEAN member states, but what happened in both summits was that they picked a location, which happened to be an ASEAN member state, the first one in Singapore, the second one in Vietnam, and both parties were willing to come to the table and negotiate. But the countries themselves, Singapore itself was not actually involved in any of the negotiations. It simply provided, I think, a venue for both sides to talk. And that's where I think ASEAN's role is when it comes to the powers outside of Southeast Asia.
Right. Another question, very much of Chilean interest here. It doesn't concern ASEAN, but APEC. Last year's APEC meeting in Chile was cancelled. How did that affect Chile's standing? How did that affect how Southeast Asian countries look at Chile, and what does it mean for APEC's future?
I think this is a question that Nicole is probably better placed to answer than me. But in Southeast Asia, at least from where I am, I don't think the cancellation had a big impact on how Southeast Asia viewed Chile, and in terms of whether, and I don't think that actually affected Southeast Asia's commitment to the APEC process. Yeah, so I mean, Chile is completely out of my research interest, so I think I better stop here in case I say something wrong. So.
No, thank you. Then one person asking, can we expect ASEAN? You actually started to mention the Rohingya. The question here is, can we expect ASEAN to take stronger action about the Rohingya in Myanmar?
Well, I think some countries in ASEAN are definitely hoping that ASEAN can take stronger action. But like I said earlier, ASEAN ultimately comprises 10 different states with 10 very different national interests, and it's basically being pulled in 10 different directions. But the thing is that without a consensus, I think ASEAN cannot take a strong position on the Rohingya issue. So I think at the moment, I don't think it is likely that ASEAN will take a strong position as an organization.
Then there's here one question by a former student who says, we have read about ASEAN a lot when they make a distinction between the old and the new member states. So the founding members and the new ones, the former Indochina, who acceded only in the 1990s. Is that distinction still valid to make?
I think to an extent, yes. I mean, the comments about expelling Cambodia and Laos, I think clearly reflect that the difference is still there. And I mean, I think when ASEAN was formed in the 1960s, the situation was very different at the time. So the 5 founding members had a certain vision of ASEAN in mind. And then with the addition of the rest of the new members in 1990s, they found themselves in a different geopolitical circumstances. So for example, the observation is that these new members, with perhaps the exception, I think, of Vietnam, these new members are closer towards China, and that has affected ASEAN cooperation as a whole. So I think that is why there are comments about Cambodia or Laos leaving the organization. But also the second difference, I think, is that the 5 founding members of ASEAN, plus Brunei, who came in 1984, I believe, these are all mostly maritime states, other than Thailand. But their concerns are different. Whereas for the newer members, they are mainland Southeast Asian states. They share a border with China. So I think the concerns between the land and the maritime states are a bit different as well. So I do think that the difference is still there, even after like 20 years now, I think, or at least 10 years. Yeah.
Yeah. That ties in quite nicely that you mentioned the distinction between the maritime and the continental outlook into the next question. That is, what is the biggest challenge for ASEAN in terms of regional order? Is it the maritime sphere, the South China Sea, the trade war, or something else?
I think
the trade war between the US and China, I suppose.
So I'm going to group all those issues together, and I'm going to say the biggest challenge for ASEAN is actually Sino-US relations, because that affects how bilateral ties between the US and China play out, affects all aspects of the regional order. So I think that is the biggest challenge for ASEAN, and unfortunately something that ASEAN cannot have a direct impact on.
Then there's one question, also always good for discussion on ASEAN, about leadership. To what extent will Indonesia continue to be committed to lead ASEAN, or will it get bored by the organization, not making much progress, and will pursue other lines of cooperation?
Well, I think, I do think that there probably has been some areas that have frustrated Indonesia when it comes to ASEAN, the Indo-Pacific, I think, being one. But I don't think that Indonesia would completely abandon ASEAN. A more likely scenario, I think, is that it would still continue to try and to assert its leadership role over ASEAN, because that helps it to, multiply its voice in the global arena. But on the other hand, it would also, I think, seek out other arrangements where it feels that it can serve its interests better. So if you recall my last slide, this is basically scenario B, I think, where countries still see ASEAN as useful for the very big or broad kind of cooperation. But on the other hand, they also try and work alongside the more functional or targeted coalitions where they have like-minded partners. Yeah.
We've already dealt with a lot of issues, conflicts, great power relations, the ASEAN way of managing regional relations or playing a role within the region. I'll take a last one because we are approaching the end, which is about ASEAN diplomacy. The question here is, I have to translate that. ASEAN's face-to-face diplomacy is seen as a crucial ingredient of the ASEAN way. Now with the pandemic, everything moves online and it is difficult to meet in the hallway during meetings. How does that affect ASEAN diplomacy and the ASEAN way in the future? Does it have a negative impact on the quality of intra-ASEAN relations?
So I have no insight into actual intra-ASEAN relations in terms of the diplomatic interactions. But I think that definitely the pandemic would probably affect the way that ASEAN is carrying out its cooperation. Because as the question rightly pointed out, a lot of ASEAN cooperation. So in ASEAN, you have the main meetings, but a lot of things get spoken about on the sidelines. So like when you see each other in corridors, the famous golf course, over dinners, karaoke sessions. And now basically all of this is done. The only platform for them, I think, is basically what we're doing right now, right? Through online face-to-face meetings. And there are just certain things that I think doesn't translate well to an online platform. So on the online platform, we can't really have, for example, a sideline conversation with one or two participants. If you wanted to do that, we don't really need this main meeting. We could have the meeting by ourselves. So I think that does affect ASEAN's traditional role a bit, because where ASEAN's value lies, I think, is that it has been a venue for a lot of meetings, whether ASEAN member states are involved or not. So for example, the Quad. Another example I can think of actually is the six-party talks when it was still going on. So there was, I think, at least one meeting of the six-party talks foreign ministers on the sidelines of an ASEAN forum. So these foreign ministers had actually never met on their own. But I think that really reflects ASEAN's function in the region. But with the pandemic, with the stopping of all these physical meetings, the convening value of ASEAN, I think, has decreased a bit. Yeah.
Right. I just browsed through the questions that are reaching me through different channels, but I think we have dealt with everything basically, and we are reaching the end of our event. So Sarah, thank you very much for your excellent disposition to answer all these questions. We hope in the famous area post-pandemic, we can welcome you personally in Chile, so you can learn firsthand about what happened with the last APEC meeting and about the Pacific Alliance.
I would love to.
Thank you very, very much again.
Thank you for
and
having
good
me.
night to Singapore.
Oh, good morning and good afternoon.
Bye-bye.